Hello, welcome. My name is Danielle Gata. I'm a new face for the virtual Parlor chats that happen every month just because I am a new member of the Morris-Jumel Mansion staff. I'm the brand new Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager. So this is my first Parlor chat and I'm super excited. We also have from the Mansion staff here, Presley Rodriguez, who's going to be helping run tech and all things on the, sort of Mansion side of things tonight. So if you see Presley, just that's who she is. She's helping me get through my very first one. So we're very thankful that she's here. So if you haven't heard of us before, we are the Morris-Jumel Mansion. We were built in 1765. We are the oldest standing residence on Manhattan. We were built by the Morris family. We have Roger and Mary Morris. And we've been around for a very long time. Our longest resident, her name was Eliza Jumel. And she's kind of what bridges the gap here between Aaron Burr and the Morris-Jumel Mansion. So Eliza's second husband was actually Aaron Burr, and that's how we kind of get connected to this duel. So yeah. Presley, if you could tap through. Alrighty, and then just some sort of housekeeping things for those who might be interested, and I hope you all are. We have a few upcoming programs. So we have Mansion and Grounds, our staple guided tour in Spanish. Every Tuesday, we are doing yoga in the park. And we also have our family day coming up this month, and then of course another virtual Parlor chat in August. So we have lots on the slate. Yoga's been popular, and on July 27th, if you know any folks who are interested in a tour fully in Spanish, we will be having that. So make sure to let folks know, let your friends know, let your family know, and we'd be happy to have them. All righty. So today we have Dr. Jason Opal with us, and just a little bit about him. Jason Opal studied history at Cornell and Brandeis universities and landed his first job as an assistant professor at Colby College in 2003. He published his first book while he was there, Beyond the Farm, National Ambitions in Rural England, which explores how ambition, the signature passion of the early republic and one of Aaron Burr's main traits, was promoted, justified, and opposed in small farm families of the new country. After publishing articles and editing a book on the religious dimensions of the U.S. constitutions and the writings of the radical Thomas Paine, Jason moved to McGill University in Montreal in 2009. As associate and then full professor at McGill, he published his second monograph, Avenging the People, Andrew Jackson, The Rule of Law and the American Nation, and began work on a history of infectious diseases in America and on the island of Barbados as the center of British colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Over the past 6 years, pardon me, that was a little weird blip in my speech. Over the past 6 years, he also published more than 60 op-eds and essays on U.S. politics, public health, and constitutionalism in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, The Conversation, and other outlets. His most recent piece for the Los Angeles Times asks us to remember the American tradition of civic friendliness in these bitter and divided times. Next month, Jason will begin as Dean and Director of the Ohio State University's Mansfield campus, where he and his colleagues will try to prove that higher education can and should be open, affordable, and transformative. So we are very lucky to have Dr. Opal here today. He is an expert on this topic. He has a lot of great stuff and info in store for you all tonight. So it should be really exciting. And yeah, now we will kind of go over the layout. So you have the option to interact with Q&A. We highly encourage it. We would love for folks to get involved, ask any questions they have. There's a Q&A option on your Zoom. You should be able to see it, and we will get those questions. Dr. Opal will be looking at them throughout the evening, and then also I'll pop back on for a designated Q&A portion of the evening, so we can kind of chat through some of your questions. But yeah, once we're done here, we're going to wrap up. This is being recorded. It'll be put on our YouTube channel. And from here, we'll kind of kick things off. So I know that Presley, who's running tech, will be turning off her Zoom camera. I'm going to stick around just for a little bit, but then I will also be turning my Zoom camera off and handing it over to Dr. Jason Opal. So to kick things off, I always like to do this, kind of get folks involved right from the get-go. But I would love for folks to put some of their sort of what they know and what they already think of when they think of Aaron Burr and his duel with Alexander Hamilton. This is the 220th anniversary just a week ago. So we're kind of at a landmark year for that. And I know that oftentimes there are a lot of different opinions on Aaron Burr and the duel. So why don't folks go ahead and drop some thoughts in there? And we'll read them out loud and kind of kick it off with that. Alrighty, so I am seeing passionate, which is an interesting one. I think that's a good way to put it. I'm also seeing vindictive, which I think is kind of a opposite coin of passionate. So that's an interesting one. Does anyone else have anything? Alrighty, we can kick it off then. Let's kick things in here. We'll turn it over to you and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you so much. So here's what to do tonight. I basically want to do one fairly conventional historical, conventional, hopefully interesting historical bit, and one sort of more, I don't know, kind of off the wall proposal. In terms of the historical bit, I want to talk about or argue or make the argument that the Burr-Hamilton duel and dueling in general and the code of honor that is reflected in duels has this very specific history in early United States. And it's not something to think of as a kind of like an old tradition that was so monolithic, but that it was really kind of like a cultural moment of a few decades, which is, you know, just a moment in the histories of nations, including our still relatively young nation. And then the more controversial, or I don't know, off the wall part is that I want to suggest, I should say at first, I am in no way endorsing or condoning interpersonal violence of any kind, especially not duels involving weapons and guns. But I would like to make the argument that the code of honor and the fear of dueling, or the fear of running afoul of the code of honor, or rather of a very particular kind of code of honor in revolutionary America, might have kind of induced or made or helped the revolutionary elite, of whom the founding fathers are kind of one little group, behave a bit better. And that actually might have helped the early United States survive its early and very tumultuous days. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen. Can someone give me a thumbs up that they can see, or say if they can see that my slides? Are we okay?
Yes, we're good.
Great. Okay. So here's my outline. First, I'll talk about the rise and fall of dueling, and give you kind of two different sort of ways to think about that. And then I'll give you a radical theory of dueling's potential utility in the early United States. All right. So dueling, the code of honor. It is clearly an aristocratic code, and we got to be really careful with the word aristocratic because it gets used far too much in early United States political discourse, and even today you hear the word misused, right? Aristocracy in the European context meant a titled group the peerage in English traditions, or the noblesse d'épée, or the nobility in a French tradition. There were a very specific group of people that in the English context were only about 1 to 2% of the population, a very small number of dukes and viscounts and barons, and then there's a larger group of gentry beneath them. And in France, similar numbers. It was only the aristocrats who had the code of honor, because it was only aristocrats who had honor. And that never changes. What does change, though, over the course of the 200 or 300 years prior to the American Revolution are the reasons and the ways that people use the code of honor. So, as we know, aristocrats, their honor and their status traditionally comes in European history from their military commands. It's from a feudal tradition in which lords commanded armies. Even though over the 15th, 16th, 17th century, the sovereign, the government, usually kings or an empire, basically took over for those private armies and established, a national army. Nonetheless, aristocrats remained by far the most heavily armed and the most militarily inclined members of society. And being a person of military command or military ability was crucial to being an aristocrat. It's what gave them their position. It's what justified their notion in society. And I think while aristocrats are easy to make fun of, especially in the United States, in an American context, and it's rather enjoyable to make fun of sort of buffoonish upper class twit aristocrats, hunting foxes and stuff. They're crucially important people who took themselves very seriously. And in 18th century, the military dimension of the aristocracy only became more defined. So as the national armies replace the private armies, as the old feudal lords become just titled aristocrats, peers, or gentry in Britain, those people monopolized or were extremely overly represented in the military officers. So if you look at, for example, at the colonels who served in the American Revolutionary War, something like 80% of the colonels, we're talking about 500 or so people, come from just about 50 or so families. And all those families were titled peerage families. So, okay, it's a military thing, but what is honor? Like, what does it actually refer to? I would say that honor, basically defined very broadly, but importantly in the 18th century, would mean what other people of note say about you. Is really what it means. It's what other people say when they hear your name. It's, in our terminology, what your name or your reputation would be. And because it's a military origin of the aristocracy, honor was bound up with courage. So it's bound up with a man of honor, although women could have honor too if they're aristocrats. Men of honor were mostly associated with people who were courageous, physically courageous especially, and also were good to their word. And you can tell this by the words that set off duels or set off affairs of honor. Most of the time in the 18th century, when there was a duel, when there was an affair of honor, and usually it started with someone saying, "You insulted me, you have questioned my honor, what do you have to say about that?" And normally the person would reply in a beautifully written reply in a letter, "No, I didn't really say that," or "I didn't really say what you think I meant." And the affair of honor closes there. Only when they say, "Yeah, I did say that because you're a blankety blank," that's when it could lead to an actual duel. So what's the blankety blank? Usually the word was coward or poltroon, which basically means the same thing, like a sniveling, weak coward, someone who's afraid. So you see how the honor was so associated with military competency or military bravery. Now, actually, I should go back. So you've got these aristocrats, you've got this code of honor, which basically says, don't insult another man of honor. Don't insult them unless you have good cause to do so. Realize that if you do question another gentleman's honor, you will likely get into a affair of honor with that person that could end up with one or both of you being shot, or, as in the earlier days, stabbed with a particular kind of sword. So that's what the code of honor was. It's military. It's about the power of the aristocracy to maintain a code of honor that was above the law, right? So by taking duels and saying we're going to settle this by duels or a code of honor, you're saying we're not going to use the state. We're not going to use the law because we are, in a certain sense, above the law, or we are, in a certain sense, beyond the law. But here's the thing. There was very few duels in colonial America, extremely few. It was a regular occurrence in Britain and France, so regular that in the 18th century, it was a major cause of casualties among the officers, because the officers were the ones who dueled, and you will repeatedly find generals and viscounts and ministers of state complaining, I wish our officers would stop shooting each other because it's really taking a toll on our officer corps. Happened all the time. In what became the United States, in British North America, dueling was almost non-existent. And so this is the first big thing to know about dueling and the Aaron Burr duel, is that it was a new thing. And let me just say a bit about why dueling was so rare in colonial America. Part of it, a big part of it, was this, we'll just call it the dissenting traditions, the religious traditions that were the dissenting Protestant groups, dissenting from the Church of England. They're more extreme kinds of Protestants, right? So in New England, those are Puritans. In Pennsylvania, those are Quakers. This is an image of a Quaker. One of their first campaigns to fight slavery was actually about the ethical consumption of sugar, which they knew was to be predominantly grown by enslaved people. So neither Quakers nor Puritans were that into the code of honor, because they were always cool to the very idea of honor itself. They thought that true esteem is only from God. That is to say, it doesn't matter, specifically, crudely put, what other people think of you. They clearly thought about what other people thought of them, but at the end of the day, what mattered was what you did in the eyes of God, who saw everything. There are those sociologists and anthropologists who make the distinction between an honor culture and a dignity culture. In an honor culture, all that matters is what people say about you. In a dignity culture, all that matters is what you feel about yourself, or the origin of that is what you think God thinks about yourself. So these two traditions, the Puritan tradition in New England, the Quaker tradition in Pennsylvania, other kinds of religious evangelical groups that call themselves New Lights, for example, were all, let's say, minimally cool to, if not hostile to, aristocratic and noble codes of honor, and definitely to dueling. But the broader or deeper reason that dueling was rare, very rare, in colonial America is because so few people had any honor at all. And why that is we have to look at maps and think about maps. People didn't say the British Empire until like the 19th century. They would refer to it as like the British plantations or the British colonies, or they would do plural, like the British Empire in the Americas. This is what it looked like around 1763, or at least how white settlers imagine it looked like. There are these strung out colonies that are spread around. They're not very well organized to each other. They're not very well oriented towards London or to the Caribbean, although they're all tied together economically. There wasn't much honor to go around. There wasn't a single nation in which people could compete for honor. There were small publics like towns or villages or assemblies that were kind of sleepy. And there just wasn't no reason to have duels because there was no honor to contest. In the words of one historian, in the colonies, there was neither a political nation nor an aristocracy to speak for it. And as hard as it is for any historian to say that another historian is right, I think that's right. That there wasn't much of a political nation, and there therefore wasn't much, nor was there an aristocracy to lead it or speak for it. Therefore, there was nothing to fight about. How then did dueling come? How did Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton end up staring down guns at each other in Weehawken? Well, I mean, the answer is, for one, it's very simple. The code of dueling, the code of honor arrived when the war started. Because in 1775 and especially 1776, for the first time, huge numbers of European aristocrats and officers who led their armies, British regular army, loyalists, the French army allied with George Washington's Continental Army, they all came at once and they all brought the code of honor. And so you immediately begin to see, especially in the Continental Army, affairs of honor coming up all the time among the officers. And again, think of the military connection, right? And usually these duels were about who did what in what battle. And, were you cowardly in a battle? Did you fight that battle well? Did you keep your word when you said you were going to take that beachhead or perform that operation? These are the things that sparked duels among continental officers, including two young, headstrong people, including Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So dueling it was implanted in America from 1775 to 1781, and then it stuck around. And this is the larger point I would like to make, which is that for so long, the colonial America had no political nation. It didn't really have much of a public, and therefore it didn't really have much honor. Suddenly it did, because for a concentrated period of time, a large number of leading men were competing furiously for honor, a particular kind of honor, which is to say the honor of having established and kept up the United States. Now, this is a classic American statement of this brief code of honor so it's a little different than the European one, because it's not so much about military status, although it had that origin. It's not so much about family lineage. It's about service in the public for the revolution, right? This is a famous quote from Franklin to his daughter in 1784, incidentally written when Franklin was actually in France. He writes, so his daughter had asked him like whether someone's honor would descend meaning like from one titled family in the French aristocracy or nobility to their kids. And Franklin replies in his sort of witty way, honor worthily obtained is in its nature a personal thing, and incommunicable to any but those who had some share in obtaining it. Honor does not descend, but ascends, which is to say, you earn it. And you earn honor in the American context, or the American Revolutionary context, by doing service for the revolution and for the new United States. Now, I want to just pause here and just say, very often we Americans overstate the amount that we were so new and having this kind of more meritocratic idea of honor, or a more meritocratic idea of wealth getting. European societies were moving that way too. You saw this, for example, in the British Army, they were giving out medals based on merit prior to the revolution. But nonetheless, there is this distinctive American moment right around the revolution when there was this frenzied effort to get honor of a particular kind, the honor of having been there, and crucial to the establishment of the United States and the success of the revolution. So that's where dueling came from in America. It was implanted by European aristocratic military culture. It had this moment 20, 30 years or so after the revolution in which large numbers of people were competing for revolutionary kind of honor, that they were some notion that their name would be tied to the success or the failure of the United States. So let me now kind of turn to, how we might fit this into the larger history of the early United States and our long and unfortunately continuing history of political violence. So let me start this way and say you could retell early American political history, and many have, as being a history of lots of political violence or near violence, of both a very serious and bloody and a kind of ridiculous kind. So start with the ridiculous kind. Here's an example. If you were trying to write history to indicate that America has always had a violent side in its politics, right? You could start with what I believe is the first physical brawl on the floor of the United States Congress. So here are the two combatants, and I'll briefly tell you the story here. This is 6 years before Hamilton and Burr have their thing. This gentleman here was a Federalist from Connecticut, a very conservative Federalist, who took exception to this gentleman. His name is Matthew Lyon of Vermont. This man is Roger Griswold. So the Federalists had divided from the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists understanding themselves as the government in the 1790s, and Democratic Republicans thinking themselves as the loyal opposition and the ones who were going to restore the revolution to its rightful place. Anyway, Griswold had earlier insulted Lyon in a way that should now be familiar. Basically, they were jawing about Federalist versus Democratic policies, and Griswold, the Federalist, snapped that Matthew Lyon was a coward. And he cited as his evidence for why Lyon was a coward that he had been dishonorably discharged from the Continental Army. Upon being called a coward, Matthew Lyon, on the floor of the U.S. Congress, spit the tobacco that he was chewing tobacco. Charming habit. He spit it into the mouth of into the face of Roger Griswold. Griswold took exception to this. He tried to have the congressman from Vermont formally censured. That vote failed. So a few days later, Griswold came into the floor of the U.S. Congress with his hickory stick. It's a walking stick, and like slapped, or not brutally, but kind of like jabbed at Lyon. Lyon then jumped up and grabbed the fire tongs out of the fireplace that was then in the floor of the U.S. Congress, and they had this ridiculous, two old men barely able to kind of fully get into motion brawl on the floor of the U.S. Congress. More seriously, of course, 8 years later, 2 years after he had killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, that duel was prompted by a series of articles written by Alexander Hamilton questioning Aaron Burr's honor. In what sense honor? Basically his trustworthiness, that he was not a person who was really committed to the revolution or committed to anything. There were also some innuendos about Aaron Burr's sexual life. Aaron Burr took exception. They sent a series of letters trying to avoid a duel. Hamilton refused to apologize. And they actually met and fought. And Hamilton, who had written, in fact, to his lawyer and to his family also the night before, saying, I'm not going to shoot at Burr. I'm not going to shoot at the colonel. I'm going to shoot in the air. Did, in fact, finish second best, the runner-up in the duel. After having killed him, this is a real sea change in ideas about dueling. There's a big anti-dueling movement. So already dueling has its rise and then fall in America. But the political violence and the political instability continued. Burr, here he is seen seeking recruits for what apparently was an effort to establish an empire in Mexico, of which he would be the emperor, I suppose, which he tried to organize on a small island in the Ohio River. And if you were, again, wanting to stress the violence in American history and early American politics, you would point to this. Then you would say, yeah, the violence and instability just continues, because even after Burr's conspiracy, whatever it was, went away, there was more conflict between the Federalists and Jeffersonians and Democratic Republicans. This is an image from the so-called embargo, which New England Federalists noted spells "Oh, grab me," written backwards. The turtle that's biting this gentleman is supposed to be the French turtle, and the gentleman over here the figure over there was a French privateer. Basically, this embargo was trying to shut down all trade with both England and France, and New England Federalists openly blew off or defied this embargo, and there were incidences of violence in which federal excise officers were intimidated or even beaten up so that the embargo was unenforced. Again, this would all be evidence that American political history has always been violent. But of course, the biggest evidence you could have, if you wanted to talk about American history being always violent and American politics being always violent and crazy, would be not the divisions between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, or Federalists and Jeffersonians. It would rather be the racial divisions, because especially after the Revolution, while it's, I think, not in dispute that white equality, the ideas of that all white people, or white men at least, were more equal, definitely was ascendant and more powerful. I think it's also very clear that the racial line hardened, which is to say that Black equality, or the idea of the equality of all people, definitely was not advanced in the same way. And this was dramatically shown in 1814 during the War of 1812, when the British landed in Maryland and Vermont and Virginia, and walk to Washington, D.C. How do they walk to Washington, D.C. without anyone shooting them? Or how do they know where to go? These are all things that are very hard in a pre-MapQuest world. The answer is that at least 1,000 enslaved Black Virginians helped them, because, of course, they saw this army potentially as an army of liberation and not as an army of invasion. There is no greater indication of the violence and fractured and divided nature of early American politics than the fact that a whole group of people understood the British as their allies, or at least white Americans as their enemies during the Second War for Independence. So one could stop there and say, so look, of course there was an Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton duel. Of course there was dueling. Of course there were fights in the Congress's floor. Of course there was the embargo and people violently opposing it. And of course there was violent support for the British on behalf of those who were enslaved. American history and American politics, we could argue, is just about various kinds of violence and of disunity. But let me just recount some of those same events, just with a different, if not tone of voice, a different weight on the argument. Yeah, it's true that in the 1798, 1799, political passions were extremely high, also in 1800 and early 1801. It's definitely true that Alexander Hamilton, who had recently been, recently kind of lost it because his mentor, George Washington, the only man who could really control him, was dead. And so Hamilton was really, they let this out of the play. I mean, he really, said some things like maybe overturning the election violently, with an army that he would command. Yeah, that happened, but that's not how it ended up. Instead, Hamilton and the other Federalists backed down. They recognized that Thomas Jefferson had clearly won the election, and Jefferson gave an address in which he famously said, "We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists." He labeled his election the Revolution of 1800, but you could just as accurately call it the Compromise of 1801 when he was inaugurated, and note that there was not political violence, that there was no large-scale fighting or even small-scale fighting, and that the political experiment of the revolution continued. Yes, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton and killed him while he was vice president. And yes, he did later try to organize some kind of half-baked, pretty crazy idea about establishing an empire in Mexico or something. No one actually knows. And yes, he was tried for treason. But the whole point of it is that instead of focusing on the violence and division, you could focus on the fact that it was a trial, that there was a rule of law, that there was a process in which Aaron Burr was actually vindicated, or he was not convicted. Incidentally, during his trial, which was held in Virginia in a federal court, one person noticed a, quote, young blackguard. Blackguard is like a kind of like a pirate from Tennessee who was sort of stalking around outside. That angry young man was Andrew Jackson, who was very angry because he had just killed someone in a duel, and he hadn't gotten the memo that dueling was already being, not just frowned upon, but widely denounced in society as an un-Republican, un-American, illegal, and aristocratic custom. Yes, you could talk about the War of 1812 being a time of extraordinary division, especially racial division. But what is most remarkable to me is that this incredibly unpopular war, in which every single Federalist voted against it, and in which huge parts of the United States actively obstructed United States military operations, resulted in no large-scale retributions against the Federalist Party, resulted in no large-scale trials for treason, even though there was plenty of evidence of direct involvement with the British in New England and other parts of the United States, especially in New England. There was none of that. There was actually no political violence after the war, and there was instead a real effort to continue the revolutionary experiment in a non-violent and lawful way. What does this all have to do with the code of honor and dueling? Well, let me say this. I think that a particular kind of revolutionary code of honor, of the kind that it kind of took form in the 1780s and 90s, so like after it was implanted by European aristocrats and officers, and then it became this thing about people trying to compete for a stake of the honor of the United States, did a lot to discipline national politics in the early republic, right? So one thing about it is that for various reasons, because the code of honor as it was installed in the early United States was installed from outside. And because it came at a sudden moment and didn't kind of grow organically, basically it looked like all the statesmen who became revolutionary elites, 300 or 400 or so people, of which the famous founding fathers are only a small number, they all understood that the different regions and states should all be considered equally honorable, right? So like the honor of Virginia or the honor of Massachusetts or the honor of Vermont were all considered to be equal. And that was actually a really important form of early national unity. There was also a general desire to avoid the duels, both because people didn't want to actually get shot unless for some extremely good cause. And in order to avoid that, to avoid actually being on a field of honor, this disciplined how people spoke. So yes, on the floor of Congress, there was the incident with Lyon and Griswold, but it's actually fairly rare. Most of the time, if you look at the speeches, they'll be criticizing someone else pretty vehemently, but they hold back from calling other congressmen coward or poltroon or scoundrel or bastard or something else like that would otherwise cause a duel, because they didn't want to have a duel, because they weren't sure if the duel was going to be accepted in the larger public. And there was this acute desire in the early years of the United States for this particular kind of honor, or they called it fame, on what they called the national stage or the global stage. You could just put it this way: the American Revolution created very suddenly this particularly intense kind of public, and it gave an opening for a large number of people to show on that public that they were worthy to be remembered. And in that sense, in that culture, there was a tremendous fear of being understood to have been acting dishonorably, to have been acting in a way that was dishonest or cowardly. There was a particular fear that you would be the one who would have undermined the early United States by spreading faction or undermining the unity of the United States. And there was an extreme stigma on someone who killed offhandedly. These words were assassin or blackguard, as we saw. These are words that were ascribed to duelists like Andrew Jackson after 1805, 1806, when the code of honor really, really fell on hard times and became heavily criticized. So I guess what I'm saying is this particular kind of revolutionary honor, this particular kind of moment where people did in fact duel and did in fact have codes of honor for the first time, it probably disciplined national politics and prevented more violence than perhaps otherwise would have occurred. And it kept the revolutionary elite very much on their toes. Now, dueling and the code lingered after 1806, 1807, when there was the first large-scale movement against it. But unfortunately, and I suppose unfortunately as well, the unwritten rules that had come with it, that you hold your tongue, that you don't go fully after someone, that you don't attack them too personally, tended to wither, and they tended to move south. So what you get after 1810, 1820 are duels much more common in slaveholding parts of the United States, the places where slavery was most dominant as an institution. And you see it increasingly gone in the North and in the Northwest. And what you see is that when that culture of a particular kind of honor came again into contact in U.S. politics and national politics in the 1840s and 1850s, it had disastrous consequences. So think back to Roger Griswold and Matthew Lyon. Yes, it was not nice of Roger Griswold. Well, it wasn't nice of Roger Griswold to call Matthew Lyon a coward. It wasn't nice of Matthew Lyon to spit tobacco juice in Griswold's face. It wasn't nice of Griswold to retaliate with his walking stick, nor of Lyon with the fire tongs. But it was more comical than violent, right? In 1856, after Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner heavily criticized slavery and referred to slavery as a, quote, harlot, the cousin of a South Carolina senator walked into the floor of the U.S. Congress with a cane and beat him nearly to death. This is an image that's very interesting, northern image, where this actually is untrue. There weren't two people with the canes. There was only one person, a man named Preston Brooks. But here in the northern imagination, another Southern tyrant is holding them kind of back while Sumner beats up and nearly kills Preston Brooks nearly kills Charles Sumner. So at the moment when the United States broke apart, the code of honor had broken apart as well. It had retreated in the North. It had been intensified in the South. And of course, this is the moment when the United States severed itself. It came apart as a country. I guess what I'd like to end with then is just an observation about the way we think about our own politics. Obviously, in the United States, we've recently seen more incidents of a tradition or a history of political violence in our culture and in our society. But what I think we should do is avoid histories that stress or say that we've always been violent and that American politics has always been about bitter and violent division. I don't think that's accurate. I think that's a argument that can be easily pushed back at, and it's an argument I think we should push back on, because at the end of the day, although violence in various forms and political violence in particular has all kinds of causes and origins and tends to brew for a long time before it actually erupts, violence is ultimately a choice. And as such, if that's a choice, then peace is also a choice. The rule of law is also a choice. And to some extent, and in some ways, and however painfully, national unity, or at least not national disunity, could also be a choice. Thanks very much.
Alrighty, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we're gonna open up the floor for questions. So make sure that you're putting your questions in the Q&A function on your Zoom, and we'll get to answering those. Kind of take a pause for a second for some folks to get those in. Okay, so one of the questions that we have is, do you think that Burr truly understood the gravity of what he was doing when the duel happened, especially because you were talking about how I think they'd like to know what was kind of the focus of him in a time where dueling was already on its way out?
That's a great question. Did Burr... So the short answer is no, I don't, and I don't think he understood. He misread just how much the code of honor was like, what's the word? Not narrow. He misunderstood just how much the code of honor and duels and violent duels were really recent and didn't have a lot of legs in America. They had, as I was trying to argue, they had like this one moment, and they probably had some utility, but they weren't like this long tradition in America. There was deep traditions against dueling, and he just didn't foresee that there would be a pretty sudden reaction to, wait, you're telling me that the vice president murdered Alexander Hamilton? That's how people thought of it. And he was brought up on charges or indicted in 2 different states. And I think this really set off the anti-dueling. I'd say it's a movement that really takes off after 1804. I don't think he saw that coming at all. And the reason I think is that he and Hamilton, I suppose, they were there from the beginning when dueling the code arrived from European officers. They had been with it, living with it for, half of their lives. And they didn't see or understand that for most Americans, this is not an American thing. This is not a thing that is okay. He really, I think, just didn't foresee that. And the evidence I would give for that is that he couldn't believe how much trouble he was in. I mean, he seemed clearly stunned that there was a kind of like, listen, you really should get out of the state because someone's going to come, a constable's going to come and arrest you. I think he just couldn't believe it. And I think also, so I mentioned Andrew Jackson, who he met later, 2 years later. Jackson too, who was just, you know, burning up with ambition and a truly, really angry, violent person, more than Burr. He had just killed a guy in a duel about it. It was probably something about a bill, but and he also just couldn't believe that there was this, really clear term of public opinion in Nashville, in Tennessee against him. And he was an incredibly unpopular person. Uh, Jackson was so unpopular. I mean, Jackson was like the last person you could ever imagine being the champion of the people in the year 1807. And he and Burr misread how much most people did not want there to be duels.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I think the next question would be, how do we make sense of historic political violence, looking back on it, not in the moment, but right now, from our modern perspective?
Yeah, yeah. So there's maybe like sort of two ways that I try to, and there's no best way. I think there's just a couple ways you can sort of try to approach it. I mean, I try to not read stuff backwards, right? So something that happens in 1804, we can only look up till 1803, right? And not try to reason backwards from where we are now. That's hard to do because, of course, we're living not now, but that's one of the major challenges in history. And I think we should always try, I definitely always try with my students to like challenge you to like reconceptualize how it is that we think things have unfolded by not putting your own the present day in the past, and trying to understand what was leading up to this, and as a general framework. The second framework would be to recognize that violence is okay. So like an overall scheme of human existence, of course, there's vast amounts of violence, and atrocity it's not common, but it's incredibly repetitive. But having said that, if you just took the days and hours of most people in most lives, no, violence is an exceptional thing. Violence is a thing that is traumatic precisely because it is abnormal. It's violently abnormal, right? It's normalcy being ripped at. Um, so I try to think of it as what could have caused violence to happen, as opposed to thinking violence just always happens. I think that's how I approach it, and maybe that's wrong. That's how I try to. And I think that, so at the very least, that it helps me to try to link up particulars and say, so I try never to say like, well, okay, Jackson and this other lawyer guy got in a duel, and Jackson killed him because it was the southern frontiers, and southern frontiers were violent. Yes, they're violent. They were slaveholding frontiers. I mean, they're definitely violent places, no question about it. But that does not explain an act of violence. It doesn't explain a particular one. It might contextualize it a bit, but you have to think more about, there was a breakdown of the law. There was a failure of the normative way of dealing with things. There was an especially violent person, Andrew Jackson. There was especially complicit lawmakers, lawkeepers. So I guess sorry, I'm going on a long way to say I try to think of violence as an unusual thing that needs to be explained, as opposed to our general state of our fate.
That was great. So our next question is, so often aristocratic trends wind up influencing working classes. Take the taste for sugar or desire for luxury ceramics, for instance. Why didn't aristocratic duels become a trend with other classes? Is it because the desire to be honorable was so specific to the aristocracy?
That's an excellent question. Again, I never thought of it. I mean, I never thought of it that way. So my usual example of how aristocratic or genteel, like, so there's like, the peers and the gentry, how that diffuses is the parlor. So like in a house where there's a parlor, what's a parlor? Like it has no utility. So it wouldn't be like in a farmer's household, right? So a parlor where there's a sitting room where you sit down and like act in a refined way, which became a middle class custom 1830s, 1840s to the present day. That's like a aristocratic court custom that the court became like in people's homes. Why didn't dueling do that? It's a great question, especially when you consider that gun ownership, although hotly contested, how many people own guns was way, way more common in the early United States than it was in England and in Europe. Always was. It's become much more so. So why wouldn't dueling do this? I think it's because I would say two things. The first is the religious traditions that always frowned upon aristocratic culture, although they still would admire aristocratic culture, still run deep, especially when it comes to the taking of life. That there's a really powerful stigma, not just the law, but the stigma against the sin of the sin, not just the crime of killing someone. And the other thing I would say is that equality, while it's so important to think about all the ways the American Revolution did not create equality, while it's so important to think about ways where the American Revolution arguably increased inequality, especially in racial terminologies, at least in the longer term. Yes, but equality was still a really important value. Like equality still had this powerful and equality in the early United States, 19th century United States. You just can't have people above the law dueling. Like it's such an obvious thumbing of the nose or shot at the bow of the principle of equality before the law. It is such a affront to this small d democratic thing of which so many Americans, I'm tempted to say really most Americans, were intensely proud in the 19th century. That was a bridge too far to have aristocrats shooting each other. And I would just say to this day, right, when do you see stuff about duels? It's in movies, popular culture. I'm not making a commentary about how high quality culture, just saying you'll find it in like movies. Like there's a movie called The Skulls about this like secret society and they have a duel. Or there's comedies where like kind of ridiculous wealthy people will say things like I demand satisfaction. It's like it's ridiculous, and that indicates the way that the code of honor was like that is not going to get across the Atlantic. That it came across for this period of time. It had this moment. It probably did some good because of how it made people behave, but it never really took hold.
Awesome. I think we're going to do one more question and then we will wrap up for the evening. So this one is, do you think we need a new ideology behind the way our government operates in terms of the code of honor and ability to argue ideas? Have we gone so far over the line that we need to re-examine our priorities when it comes to decorum?
It's a wonderful, not just question, but like sentiment. So I really think that's an important, yeah. And like, to me, it's sort of like, how does one do that? So I do think it's important to think about really simple linguistic tendencies, because language frames things, right? So words, they don't just reflect actions, they create them, right? So for example, there was a tradition that I think is a good tradition in the early republic for presidents, who were often not the ones who were the most like biggest loudspeaker, but they certainly were, prominent, to say, friends and fellow citizens, the word friends, which is itself like a very equal idea, right? So friends are equal. And so friendship had this really great moment in early America where it was celebrated as a political value. Like our starting point should be that we're friends. Friend doesn't mean you're a family. Friend doesn't mean you have to be like in agreement. Friend doesn't even mean you have to really like much care for the person. It just means that you're like friendly towards them. And I think things like that, or just kind of like emphasizing that in order to have a peaceful world, in order to have a world where the rule of law is not a joke, then there has to be some degree of self-discipline on the part of those who have the ear of the public, which today in our digital world is like anybody can have the ear of any kind of public. So there's something about the responsibility of speech, about the responsibility of like watching what you say and being careful to just try to hold it, and to do, do you really need to insult someone, is just really important. And maybe if I could just end with like, or I mean, such a great sentiment, like a really extreme example that's coming into my mind, is I mentioned the dissenting traditions, the Puritan tradition. So, there were witchcraft accusations, obviously, places like Salem, which I was in recently, which is making me think of it. And but the thing is, it was so rare for someone to. The thing about that incident that was so dramatic is that it was so appalling for someone to accuse someone of being evil, which is what a witch was, like an embodied evil. That it was really risky business to call someone a witch, right? You don't just do this lightly. It's like the verbal atomic nuclear weapons, and that probably inhibited and like kind of probably improved certain kinds of speech, because people did not want to go that far. They didn't want to get into a situation where they were going to call someone else evil. And I guess it's just like understanding that and thinking speech is always powerful, therefore it comes with responsibilities. And if there's ways that we can say, I mean, myself too, certainly can use language to remind ourselves that we can also be friends, that we can also be peaceful, and that we can also live under the rule of law, which for all its fault is definitely better than the alternative, then that's a good thing.
Alrighty, I think that is a wonderful note to wrap up on. So thank you everyone for attending our virtual Parlor chat. Thank you to Dr. Jason Opal for being here and sharing all of his knowledge and being so willing to spend the evening with us. And we are just so glad that everybody could make it. And you can always reach out to us on our social medias or via email at info@morris-jumel.org. If you have any questions following up, again, this will be on YouTube. And just thank you again so much for joining us, Dr. Opal, and all of you in the audience. Have a good night.